Hello everyone, and welcome back to our final lecture on World War I, the Great War. Today we are going to wrap things up. We're going to see America emerge in this conflict, and we're going to see them turn the tide of war in Europe. We're also going to take a look at the Treaty of Versailles, in which, well, frankly, one of the worst documents ever drawn up by humans, and we'll take a look at why it so utterly failed and why it led to a whole new generation of people being killed 20 years down the road. So we will get to all of that, and let's go ahead and turn to the notes and get started. All right, so we mentioned yesterday in our lecture about how this was a new type of war, right? The Industrial Revolution had really changed warfare forever. And at the beginning of this conflict, they frankly, I don't think they really realized it. They were sending thousands of men in frontal assaults against machine guns that were spraying, thousands of bullets per minute. That just led to bloodshed, and it took a few years before they really began changing the strategy overall. Now, we mentioned the trench lines at the very beginning when we talked about the Western Front emerging and the Eastern Front, but those trenches is where most of the fighting would happen. And a couple terms you need to know. First of all, no man's land. That was the land in between the trenches. And rightfully so, it was called that way because that was a very dangerous place to be. When you would crawl out of the trenches and actually go over the top, that's another term you need to know. When you were up there in no man's land, you were exposed. Enemy snipers, enemy machine guns, enemy artillery. Artillery killed about 80% of people in World War I. So, there were a lot of threats to soldiers, but man, you were much safer when you were in the trenches, even though you were definitely still in harm's way. I know this slide's kind of gross, but the fact is we need to talk about this because this is one of the side effects of war that we often don't cover is disease and how that affects the soldiers fighting. So, often, the deadliest part we think is across the battlefield with the enemy shooting at us. But for many soldiers, it was happening right there in their own trench line of the worst combat. Things like trench foot, trench mouth, where these men are standing in water, sometimes for days, if not weeks at a time. You think about when you're in a bath too long, right? What ends up happening? Your hands get all pruny. Now imagine standing in ice cold water on days on end. Think about what that would do to your feet. And in old war movies, they're always talking about make sure you change your socks, make sure you have dry socks on. Well, this is the reason why, because trench foot was a major problem in World War I and caused many men to have their feet amputated. And that brings me to another point. We often fit these wars into nice bookends. This war lasted from 1914 to 1918. For often the men and women and sometimes the children that are engaged in these conflicts, for some of them the war never ends. You have an entire generation of young men here that are fighting that are watching their friends die. Some of them are losing body parts. And that would stay with them the rest of their life. I mean, this is something that is happening to them as young men, and literally, I mean, they would have to deal with this every day for the remainder of their life, decades after the peace had been made. So I think that's a good lesson for us: is that wars do not end when nations sign peace treaties. The war continues for many soldiers for a very, very long time. I'm actually going to skip that page. So another way that things had changed was the new weapons. And I mentioned that, with machine guns spraying bullets as fast as they can. The Industrial Revolution was truly key in changing the type of weaponry that we are seeing in World War I. What's interesting is the strategy of fighting out of trenches. We actually have seen that in a couple previous wars. Even go back to the Civil War, the American Civil War. There's a lot of battles that were fought where the men dug down trenches and were fighting out of those. So we've seen that tactic kind of emerge, but the weaponry in this conflict was bar none. I mean, it was completely different than anything we had seen in world history. For the ground combat, we have brand new weaponry like tanks, and you can see a picture of the old style of tank there. If you're in Kansas City, you can go to the World War I museum. They have one of these tanks on display. In fact, it complete with a big hole in the side where a shell went through there. You notice that the tanks are much smaller than what you would see and know later on, modern tanks and even tanks in World War II. These tanks were much slower, and they were primarily used as infantry support. So as a group of troops were supposed to go over no man's land, they could file in behind the tank for cover. The tank could also press over barbed wire that would lay down to try and stop infantry from coming. So World War II, it kind of becomes almost a roaming artillery piece. That is not necessarily the case here. It did have a small cannon on the front, but it was not used for the same purposes. And the tanks in World War II are going to move much quicker as well. So this is the first time a tank has been used in combat. So a major evolution of warfare in and of itself. The machine gun, there have been, again, this is kind of an evolution of a weapon. There have been things like the Maxim gun, where you had kind of this rotating turrets. But here, I mean, it is the deadliest that it's ever been in history. Poison gas. This to me is, I think, the scariest part of the entire war. Both sides were using it. You can see the gas mask that was given. In fact, this actually helps explain Adolf Hitler's mustache. I always have kids asking me, why did he wear that silly mustache? Well, first of all, the kind of trends of the time. Charlie Chaplin had a very similar style mustache, one of the first celebrities, Hollywood celebrities. But back to the point, Adolf Hitler was fighting in this war for Germany. Even though he was an Austrian, he was fighting in this war for Germany. And there was a gas attack one day in which he actually was somewhat exposed because his gas mask would not go completely over his face, and it was because of his mustache, so he cut it down. At least that's one story that I've heard regarding why he had that shorter mustache. But poison gas was, frankly, it was terrifying for people on both sides. You had things like chlorine gas, which of course we now use, in less concentrated versions in pools, but mustard gas. I mean, I've heard reports of people being exposed to mustard gas that, I mean, literally would cough so violently parts of their lungs would come up. I mean, this was not the way to go out. And what made gas even scarier was that sometimes this poison gas would lay low. It's heavier than air, so sometimes it would lay low in craters. So, there may be a gas attack, and 3 days later, the whistle sounds to go over the top, and you're running across the battlefield in and out of these crater shells, when all of a sudden you go into one that has gas still in it, and you're exposed from gas that maybe your own side used. You just never knew. And even during the attack, there were multiple times where the winds would shift and the gas would blow right back onto the faces of the side that shot it. It was a horrible, horrible weapon. And frankly, in World War II, we're just really not going to see it used on the battlefield as much because both sides recognized how horrible it truly was. We also have things like flamethrowers, just as horrible of inventions as you can come up with on how to kill your fellow man. But that becomes another very iconic weapon of World War I. The periscope rifle, that's one where you could actually shoot from within a trench and kind of use the periscope almost like a submarine would. Excuse me. One of the most amazing advances that had happened in recent years was the invention of the airplane. And of course, it would not take long for people to adapt that to warfare and to use it to kill human beings. Originally in World War I, airplanes were being used for reconnaissance. They had previously used things like hot air balloons for reconnaissance, but airplanes are perfect for this. They can go up and they can fly over enemy territory. They can map out where the enemy is, fly back and hand it back. Well, both sides by 1914 have airplanes, and in fact, kind of the evolution of aerial combat. Those first few months and years, the pilots were going up and they were taking plots of where the enemy was, returning back to their side. Eventually, they're realizing, hey, that other airplane up here is doing the same thing, and then they're bombing our guys. So eventually the pilots started taking handguns with them and started firing revolvers at the other pilots. And then, of course, the next evolution of that, they began placing even heavier machine guns on the front of the airplanes, and you have the invention of aerial combat for the first time in human history. You also have another iconic weapon used here, Zeppelins. Zeppelins flew at extremely high altitudes, very difficult to shoot down, but they would drop bombs on cities, and I believe even London. I can't remember if it was, might be misplaced in that, but I know at one point Zeppelins went over London. I believe it was in this conflict. Sea combat, what's happening in the oceans. Of course, we talked about the German U-boats, an advancement of submarine technology, which was obviously key to them almost winning this whole thing. Dreadnoughts. The British are going to develop what really is the world's first battleship, and it was an amazing vessel that it made sure that it was well armed, massive ship, and frankly would change the history of naval warfare forever. So, like I said, the United States is involved. We have, Congress has declared war against Germany and their allies. A couple of notable figures that I would like you to know. First of all, General Blackjack Pershing. Pershing was actually from Missouri. He gained his notoriety in the Spanish-American War and got his nickname by leading the group of African-American soldiers known as the Buffalo Soldiers. The military is still segregated, and it would be until after World War II. And I want to make sure we remember this, that everyone had the equal opportunity to fight and die for their country, but depending on your color, you may only be allowed to fight and die next to people of your own color. So even in warfare, this hypocritical focus on race played into it. But Pershing said that the African-American soldiers he fought with in the Spanish-American War were the best soldiers he had ever fought with. He was proud of his commanding of them, and even though African Americans would not have the same rights and privileges back at home or even on the battlefield, the display of heroism that they've showed in every war is pretty amazing to have that kind of loyalty, even when your rights are being denied back home. But Pershing is going to be the one that commands the entire AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, which is, again, the official name of the American military over in Europe. So he is the top dog, top brass, making all the key decisions as to where Americans are supposed to go. The next one, Alvin York. He's probably the most famous soldier from World War I. Originally, he had identified himself as a conscientious objector, which, as we know from previous in our notes, that meant that he objected to war based off of religious reasons. Ultimately, he was drafted, decided to go in. At one point, he found himself basically surrounded and with over 100 Germans, but he used... He basically convinced them that they were surrounded, and he was able to pick off 25 German soldiers before the remaining actually surrendered. And Alvin York, one man, captured 132 Germans on his own and became, frankly, the most notable war hero from World War I. Now, America is going to make a tremendous impact in this war, just with our sheer fighting force alone. 4 million young men would be mobilized in this conflict, and it truly does turn the tide against Germany. Germany was winning this war, and perhaps I don't focus on that enough, but 1917, especially once Russia gets out, man, it looks like Germany is literally weeks, if not months, away from winning this war. But they were unprepared for the American power, manpower, but also our industrial power, because back home, we are able to take that newly formed industrial revolution-based economy, and we are able to change it basically overnight, from making consumer goods, goods that you and I would use, to war-based goods. So a textile company, a clothing company that makes sweaters may now all of a sudden make uniforms. A company that makes cars now all of a sudden may make tanks. Not every country has that ability to kind of flip the switch and start producing for the war, but America has already become the #1 industrial power in the world, and we are putting that to use in this conflict. No one believes that America is, frankly, an upper tier country yet. We're not, but we're starting to show glimpses as to what will make us that upper tier country. Employment. I mentioned segregation earlier, Jim Crow era, which we are still heavily in at this point. When 4 million men go off to go fight in Europe, that opens up a lot of job opportunities here back at home. And frankly, what you have happen is you have roles that previously had been held strictly by white men, but now there's a need for those jobs to be filled, and for the first time ever, some of them are being filled by African American men, or sometimes even women of all races. So, people that wouldn't normally have those types of jobs, because there was kind of this vacuum, they were allowed to have them. So this same thing's going to happen in World War II, and to a much greater extent, especially with women in the workplace. And the result is, those people become used to that kind of level of income and that type of job, and especially once they, of course, prove themselves as strong workers, it changes everything. I mean, we really have trouble going back to how things were before. This job is only for white males. This is changing things within the home. Every war changes our country in some way, and in this case, it was for the good, at least in this scenario. The government will even create. Remember, we've talked before in previous lectures about how laissez-faire the government's been, about how kind of hands-off everything. The government is, of course, fully into this war. They create what's called the War Industries Board, which helps industries make that switch from consumer-based goods to war-based goods, and so even the government itself is getting heavily involved. Now, we covered some major battles that took place before America got involved. I want to cover kind of the latter part of the war, 1918 for the most part, last year of the war. Some major battles. Not every battle. We don't have time for that. I wish we did. But again, I'm going to go in and tell you kind of what I consider to be the most important parts of these major battles. First of all, the Battle of the Argonne Forest. This was one of the deadliest in American history. You had 26,000 Americans dead. This was kind of a larger offensive. Once America got there, we went on the offense with the Entente powers, and this was a part of that offense against the Germans that helped in the war. In 1918, you have the Battle of Belleau Wood. In this battle, 1,800 U.S. were killed, and this was what helped end the last German push. So they kind of responded. They understood that the Entente was going on the offensive, and they pushed back. The Battle of Belleau Wood took place in that defense. But these numbers, guys, 26,000 Americans dead in one battle. I just hope you understand. We cannot allow that to become just a statistic. 26,000. I think I said 100 earlier. 26,000 Americans. That is more than have died in many wars that we've fought. And here it is, a singular battle. Just absolutely horrendous loss of life. By November, the war ended up coming to an end, and Germany did end up signing a ceasefire. They signed an armistice, which just means an end to the fighting. They didn't quite yet give up, but the fact is, and this I don't ask you to memorize too many dates. This is one date I would like you to know. It's the easiest date you could ever read, because the armistice was signed, follow me, at the 11th hour, the 11th day, at the 11th month. Okay? 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So on November 11th, 1918, we signed the armistice with Germany. They agreed to quit fighting, kind of a ceasefire of sorts. And, frankly, this was a shock to the Germans. Many of them on the ground, many soldiers on the ground, did believe that if anything, they were probably winning the war at this point. And so for news to spread that their government had just given up and signed the ceasefire, that was shocking to many Germans. And it created a lot of anger, and especially given the next 10 years of really tumultuous politics and economics in Germany. This is that moment that this is kind of the beginning of the radicalization in Germany that will lead to the Nazi takeover. Adolf Hitler is one of those that is angry about, and frankly, he sees it as, he believes his country has turned on him. That Germany has turned on its people by signing the ceasefire, and we'll talk about the treaty in the next slide. But many Germans feel betrayed. This is kind of the beginning of the knife in the back theory that the German government stabbed the German people in the back, and it's going to lead to basically the overthrow of the government in the 1920s and 30s. World War I left 16 million people dead. That's approximately 10 million military and 7 million civilian. We don't often talk about the civilians, but civilian deaths, and again, nothing that they did wrong. People just like you and me that were living their lives in their homes, and perhaps a shell fell on it and killed everyone inside. 7 million civilians dying in this conflict, just absolutely terrible. This was the deadliest conflict we had ever seen in world history, and sadly it would be overshadowed within 20 years by World War II. Now, Woodrow Wilson is President of the United States at this time, and Wilson is really kind of seen as a hero of this. After all, it was the Americans coming in that in some ways, really turned the tide against Germany, and Wilson is kind of seen as this symbol of freedom and democracy throughout the world. Now, he wrote his most influential speech, and by the way, his job before he was president, history professor. He was a history teacher at Princeton University. Anyways, so perhaps there's perhaps I have hope of becoming president one day, following the steps of Wilson. Wilson's most famous speech is called the 14-point speech, and in this speech he calls for the creation of what's called a League of Nations. We looked at the situation that got us into World War I, and we said, how could this be possible that literally one man being assassinated by another singular man led to the entire world erupting in conflict? Wilson said we have to have safeguards to prevent that kind of thing from happening again. One way we can safeguard against that is by having a League of Nations, an organization where every nation in the world sends a representative, and we can actually talk these things out before militaries are used. Great idea. I will tell you that the League of Nations fails drastically. We won't get into the logistics of it quite yet, but it fails miserably. The idea was great. But the execution was horrible. Now, we would eventually end up with an organization like this called the United Nations after World War II, but at least in this interwar period from World War I to World War II, League of Nations fails miserably. Now, the ones that are getting together to sign or to write the peace treaty, which will become known as the Treaty of Versailles, were the representatives of 4 countries: the United States, France, Britain, and Italy. Major powers of the Entente. But there is one country that is missing. Well, frankly, there's a couple countries missing in this that you might think would want to have some say. Russia. Russia fought on the Entente side, but they withdrew from the war early, and so they are not invited. Now, that is going to play out in Russia. They're quite angry about that, but you can kind of see why they would be excluded, but they're going to pay a penalty for that because they're going to lose a lot of land. In fact, they're going to lose more land than anyone else, including Germany. Germany's also not included. And, what that means is that all of the things Germany will have to sign on to, they're going to be kind of forced into signing this document. They're going to have to agree with everything, and they have no say in the matter. So the big four are the ones creating the Treaty of Versailles. We're first going to talk about the terms of the treaty, and then we'll talk about how pretty much every single one of these failed miserably. The first one, which I think you could argue was maybe a good, a good addition, or at least has probably the longest lasting impact here, is the establishment of new nations. So I wish I had a map on this slide, but you do have new nations created out of some of these former empires. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they're going to lose a lot of land, and they're going to create new nations from that land. So Poland, which had existed previously, centuries before in Poland had existed as a state, and it's going to reemerge here as a new nation. Obviously, Poland will become very important in World War II. It's the first nation invaded in Europe at the beginning of that conflict. Czechoslovakia is another nation that will emerge out of the Treaty of Versailles. Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia combined a lot of those areas in the Balkans. So, anyways, and one thing that I've always found to be fascinating is go back to how this war started, right? The assassination of the Archduke by the Black Hand, by the Serbian government that wanted to, recreate Greater Serbia, kind of got their wish. That's what Yugoslavia kind of became. Serbia was a part of Yugoslavia, was the capital, had the capital within it. That's the crazy part about all this, is that they actually kind of got what they wanted, and they're the ones that started the whole thing, at least in my mind. Sorry to any Serbians out there. Number two, demilitarized Germany. This is seen as a very harsh measure, but Germany would be, for the most part, gutted of their military. They still were allowed some to, defend their borders. I believe they could not have any air force at all. I think that's what it was. But they could have some ships, but not anything that would remotely look like a modern-day military. That is going to be one of the first things that Adolf Hitler violates. And he's going to violate every single one of these items when he takes over. But the demilitarization of Germany was seen as a very harsh measure. And when Hitler begins to secretly rebuilding the military, and even when that's found out, for the most part, people don't blink, because it was kind of seen as such a harsh measure that, maybe they should have more planes. I don't know. Number three, Germany must return land to France and pay for war costs. This is another big one, because Germany, with not only the land, that's going to be some of the first places that they take back in World War II, areas along what's called the Rhineland and Alsace-Lorraine, kind of areas right there along the border. Basically, France gets that land. But the bigger one is they have to pay for war costs, which I think were about $11 billion. Germany's just been defeated in this war. They've just used every resource their country has had. They're not going to have the money to pay for this war. So that is going to fail miserably. Number four, I keep saying this, but perhaps this is the biggest one, and or at least the biggest slap in the face to Germany, and that is they had to sign what became known as the Guilt Clause. They had to agree that they were the ones that started the war. Now, why is that such a big deal, you may ask? Well, I think most people would agree that they didn't start the war. Right? The war started in the Balkans between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Germany was just kind of the first major player that got involved. But they did not create the war, but here they're having to admit that they did. That's seen as unjust. And this, again, the German government at the time is going to be overthrown later on. And a lot of Germans felt as if they are being betrayed by all these things that they sign on to in the Treaty of Versailles. So what are some problems with this treaty? Number one, humiliated Germany. Like I just said, to have to admit that they started the most horrible conflict in the history of mankind, that's humiliating to them, and they resent it, and they want revenge. Number two, Russia not being involved. Look at how much land is being lost by Russia between 1914 and 1923. Now, part of this is because they actually signed away a lot of this in the treaty that they signed with Germany to withdraw from the war. They actually gave a lot of this land away. So instead of giving that land back to Russia, as Russia felt they were due, the Big Four instead created those new nations out of this land. So Russia feels betrayed as well. Now Russia will eventually fight on our side in World War II. Not initially, though. Initially, they have a non-aggression pact with Germany, and in fact, they agreed to divide Poland. That's how World War II starts in Europe. Dividing Poland. The Russians invade from the east and the Germans invade from the west. It is all tied back to this exact moment at the end of World War I. You do not have a World War II without a World War I. Right? Number 3, didn't offer any reconstruction help. And I say this, it may not have been intuitive at the time, but we know now that instead of punishing the enemy, driving them deeper into debt, driving them to more radicalized leaders, that instead probably the best way to handle this would have been to reverse course and actually maybe help them, rebuild cities and help them, emerge as an ally versus just a punished enemy, former enemy. This is the exact, I love this political cartoon. You got Adolf Hitler crawling out of the Treaty of Versailles. Without the Treaty of Versailles, I don't know if Adolf Hitler rises up as the leader he does. I really don't think so. But anyways, and by the way, we will not make this mistake in World War II. With the Marshall Plan, we do offer a lot of help to countries that we have just finished bombing, but those countries turn into our greatest allies in the future. It's a major history lesson, is that instead of punishing countries, try to get them on your side. And Germany and Japan have since World War II been two of our strongest allies. So it's an important lesson that I think we can all learn from. Number 4, countries don't buy into the League of Nations. Great idea, have this organization where all the nations of the world can have representatives. But countries don't buy into it, including the United States. The U.S., it was our idea. It was Wilson's idea. But Congress, Wilson was a Democrat. Congress was full of Republicans. They do not like the idea of having, they were afraid, and they did have some reason to be afraid. They did not want us to be drawn into another European conflict. I understand that. Okay, but when you don't have the biggest voices in the world as a part of what's supposed to be a worldwide organization, it's not going to work. And the League is extremely weak, and that becomes well known once Germany and Japan just literally walk out the door in the next 20 years. The results of the war: 110,000 U.S. soldiers dead. The U.S. spent $33 billion on the war. It is very, very costly, and as we said earlier, 16 million deaths, 20 million more wounded. You can see reparations, $55 billion in reparations that would have to be paid towards France by Germany. It's just, I tell you what, this is not setting up for a positive future. And on top of all this, and you guys are probably more aware of this than any other class I've had, in 1918, you have the worst flu outbreak in world history. One of the deadliest strains of flu launches. Now, it is called the Spanish flu. It was not caused by the Spanish. This was actually caused by Kansas. Okay, most historians believe that the Spanish flu actually started in Kansas. There's a military base in Kansas that they believe those soldiers took it over to the battlefield at the end of World War I and spread the flu, in which many people from other countries took it home. Ultimately, during the 1918-1919 flu epidemic, you had about 40 million people killed globally. Just an astounding number, just absolutely terrible. More than the war itself and the plague combined. That should tell you everything you need to know about it. This was an extremely deadly disease, and and especially to suffer this at the very end of the war. You've just wrapped up this horrible conflict, but to have just now all of a sudden people at home are dying, and the young and the elderly, just absolutely terrible. Most of the men or maybe not most, but many of the men who actually died in the last year of combat over there actually died because of the flu. So And by the way, I didn't mention why it was called the Spanish flu. The Spanish are going to be neutral in this conflict, and because of that, they did not really have any reason not to report their flu statistics. Most other countries that are fighting this war, they did not want to report their actual numbers because they were afraid that could be used against them by the enemy. But Spain was neutral. They could report their numbers. So they ended up reporting much higher numbers than everyone else. Even though they were accurate, what that led to was people saying, well, Spain's where it's happening most, therefore it's the Spanish flu. Guys, that will wrap it up for World War I. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the Great War, a very, very difficult time in human history. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email. I'm happy to get back to you. Thank you.